LinkedIn presents.
Good morning. I'm Michael Kovnat, and this is the Next Big Idea Daily, where we unpack the best new nonfiction one big idea at a time. Now, you may have noticed that these days it seems like political polarization isn't just louder, it's deeper, more personal, and harder to escape. So what's going on? If it's true that extreme ideologies are on the rise, why do some people get swept up in them while others don't? Well, today we'll hear a surprising answer from author Lior Zmigrod. Lior is a pioneer in the emerging field of political neuroscience. She studied at the University of Cambridge and has held visiting fellowships at Stanford, Harvard, and both the Berlin and Paris Institutes for Advanced Study. And she made it onto the Forbes list of 30 under 30 in science. Lior's new book is called The Ideological Brain, and in it, she reveals how our thought patterns and even our brain structures can shape the way we relate to political ideas. It's a mind-expanding look at why ideology sticks and how flexible thinking might just be our way out. Lior's here to share her big ideas right after this quick break.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, host of Everyday Better, an award-winning podcast dedicated to personal development. Join me every week for captivating stories and research to find more fulfillment in your work and personal life. Listen to Everyday Better on the LinkedIn Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lior Zmigrod, the author of The Ideological Brain, a book which explores why some people are particularly susceptible to extreme worldviews and how features of their brains and everyday thought patterns can render some people especially vulnerable to rigid dogmas, and which traits can make other people more resilient in the face of extreme and authoritarian ideologies. As a political neuroscientist, I've studied these questions with the tools of psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and even genetics, which has led me to arrive at some unexpected conclusions. And by investigating these questions, I found that our brains come to mirror our politics and prejudices in a lot of strange, profound, and sometimes astonishing ways that really challenge how we understand the tensions between nature and nurture, risk and resilience, freedom and fate. And today I'm excited to share with you 5 key takeaways that I've learned from researching all the work that's gone into the ideological brain. We can study why people gravitate towards extreme worldviews by studying their brains. Our ideologies are not only about society and culture, they're also driven by things that run deeply in our biology. And a growing body of research shows that there are psychological and even neurobiological differences between adherents to different ideologies. And so we need to shed the assumption that ideologies are primarily collective, sociological movements or historical currents kind of floating above our heads. And instead, we can think of ideologies as personal, tangible, and psychological, things that we can really observe and measure at the level of the individual. By examining how ideologies shape human minds, we can pose questions that we never thought to ask before, such as to what degree an ideology can be internalized by the believer's brain, and how does it affect the believer's cognition or their brain's structure and function? And could it be that certain brains have particular predispositions that make them susceptible to more extreme worldviews? By thinking about how ideologies become psychologically internalized, we can focus on ideological thinking, which I define as a way of thinking whereby a person adopts a fixed doctrine about the world that resists all opposing evidence, and a fixed identity through which they can judge themselves and others. Experimental psychology and neuroscience can illuminate what unconscious traits render some of us more likely to gravitate towards dogmatic ideologies with fixed doctrines and identities, and what makes others more resilient against these closed and authoritarian ways of thinking. Susceptibility to extreme worldviews is not a binary, it's actually a spectrum. What we discover is that we all lie on a spectrum of suggestibility, and this spectrum reflects the interaction of all the psychological traits that make people susceptible to ideological thinking, such as their biological or cognitive dispositions, their personalities and social experiences, their traumas and perceived resources, abundances, realities, and absences. And importantly, spectrums are less neat than clear binaries. It can be tempting to imagine that there are two categories of people, the vulnerable and the resilient, the radical minority who can be manipulated into monstrosity, and the sensible majority who are immune to dangerous or extreme ideologies. But in fact, there are gradations in vulnerability, and recognizing that it's a continuum is crucial because it allows us to detect subtle differences that we would otherwise ignore. And this distribution of susceptibility really is like a Gaussian curve, with most people falling in the middle and some people at the outer edges. Some people are extremely dogmatic, and some are very strongly undogmatic. And acknowledging that susceptibility to extreme worldviews is continuous reminds us that few people are completely immune to the power of ideological reasoning and community. And so if we lie on the spectrum, we must confront our own vulnerability. Really, through this science, we can understand what makes us susceptible and what makes us resilient. And through psychological experiments that I conducted while at the University of Cambridge, I found that one of the psychological factors that is most likely to increase people's preferences for closed ideological narratives and identities is their level of cognitive rigidity. So cognitive rigidity is this trait which reflects whether people prefer closed, constant ways of thinking that are very much kind of rigid and opposing to evidence and change, or whether they're more cognitively flexible and they can adapt to change, whether they can kind of change between different mental tracks as they're thinking about the world. And in experiments I've conducted with hundreds of participants, I found that people on the political extremes are more likely to struggle with cognitive tasks that require adaptable behavior or inventive imagination. So, for example, when I've wanted to measure how cognitively flexible someone is, I've given these cognitive games and linguistic challenges. One of these is called the Wisconsin card sorting test, and it measures people's adaptability. It gives people a kind of game, a set of cards that they have to sort according to some rule. So they'll start sorting this deck of cards, and maybe they'll figure out that they get rewarded every time that they sort a card according to its color, when they take a blue card and match it with another blue card. And then people learn that rule and they apply it. They'll match a green card with a green card, a yellow card with a yellow card, and they'll continue and develop a kind of habit, a kind of ritual that's very fulfilling, that's very rewarding. They get kind of confirmation and affirmation every time they apply the rule. But then suddenly, at one point in the game, the rule changes, unbeknownst to the participants. And what I'm interested in is that moment of change. Some people, the most cognitively flexible people, notice that change, and rather than resisting it, they adapt their behavior, they change their behavior, they start learning the new rule and applying it instead. On the other hand, there are other people who are more cognitively rigid, and when they encounter the change, the fact that the old rule no longer works, they really resist that change. They hate the change. They try to apply the old rule again, to apply that old ritual, even though it no longer works. And those people are the most rigid, the least adaptable, most insistent that the world should not change. And what I found is that people's level of rigidity in these kinds of neuropsychological tests really reveals the rigidity with which they believe in ideologies in the social and political world. So people who are most rigid on this kind of cognitive game tend to be the most rigid when they evaluate ideological information. They're most extreme politically, both to the right and to the left. They're most extreme in terms of their nationalisms. They're most willing to die and kill for their ideological cause and group. And so really we see that cognitive rigidity is a risk factor for making people more likely to engage with extreme worldviews, but at the same time, that cognitive flexibility, a capacity to adapt, to see nuance, to see all shades of gray, is a real form of psychological resilience against extreme ideologies. And so what we need to remember is that these unconscious cognitive traits can really foreshadow our ideological commitments and how willing we are to adapt our behavior in the face of evidence. The structure and function of our individual brains can mirror our political beliefs, so that these differences between people who believe in different ideologies or people who believe in extreme ideologies versus people who are less dogmatic can even show up when we look at people's brains, at their physiology, their neurobiology, and we discover real differences in the structure and function of brains of different ideologues. So for instance, we see that areas responsible for high-level decision-making in the prefrontal cortex, the area behind our forehead responsible for the most complicated decision-making, those areas are sized differently and operate differently depending on whether a person is very radical or much more independent of ideological ways of thinking. And similarly, looking at people's brains can help us see who is most prone to left-wing ideologies or right-wing ideologies. Neuroscientists have discovered, for example, that people who believe in more right-wing ideologies tend to have an area of the brain called the amygdala, which is the area of the brain responsible for processing negative emotions such as threat, fear, disgust. That area is larger in people with more right-wing belief systems than in left-wing belief systems. And that is a finding that's been replicated in multiple studies in multiple countries. And it raises so many questions, maybe as many questions as it does answers. Because on one hand, it shows that there is a kind of parallel between people's brain structure and their ideologies, but it also raises the question of why. Why, for instance, would the size and function of a person's amygdala be related to their politics? Some people think that maybe amygdalas are area of the brain that is responsible for processing negative emotion. Perhaps the fact that conservative ideologies sometimes can also be very much obsessed with explaining feelings of threat, of fear, maybe there's a kind of resonance there that explains that pattern. But there's still a kind of question about causality, and it's almost a chicken and egg problem, whether we have these psychological traits, these even neurobiological traits that affect which political kind of groups we join, or whether being immersed in certain ideologies can be a process that affects our psychology, our cognitive patterns, even our neurobiology. So it's a chicken and egg problem because we're trying to determine what comes first. Does our psychology affect our politics, or can our politics also affect our psychology and even our brain? And through my book, throughout the Ideological Brain, I explore this kind of two-sided discovery, how each person's brain can affect the social and political ideologies that they embrace and gravitate towards, and how extremely they take those ideologies. And secondly, that our ideologies might be able to shape our brains and bodies in return. And that's one of the most fascinating aspects of this for me, finding that our ideological beliefs are really related to our cognitive and neural patterns of responding to the world, which to me means that society as a whole needs to face new questions about how our bodies become politicized and how deeply into the body ideologies and rigid ways of thinking can really penetrate. And between all of that, we're really starting to think about what it means to exercise personal agency. How do we resist authoritarian ideologies? And what does it mean to be highly ideological? And how can we all become more flexible thinkers? If we want to think in more flexible, free, and authentic ways, one of the first steps we need to take is to question our habits, because habits are repetitive behaviors that we enact automatically. And in many ways, we live in a society that glamorizes habits. that encourages all of us to incorporate more routines, more habits into our daily lives. But in fact, habits can be deeply dangerous. And almost all ideologies use the psychological mechanics of habits in order to establish devotion, loyalty, and passionate commitment to the ideological cause in ways that can make people injure others and injure themselves. And so in the Ideological Brain, I explore what it means to extinguish these habitual thoughts and behaviors in favor of thinking in ways that are more adaptable and creative. And I think that nurturing a kind of mental freedom, a kind of mental creativity in all domains of life is a key way in which we can become more flexible, evidence-based thinkers, politically, ideologically, and just in our general attitude to life. And so I hope that the Ideological Brain takes all of this science that stretches from the psychology to the neuroscience, and even the genetics, and also thinks about all the environmental factors that can make a brain more likely to embrace a really rigid ideological doctrine, and also understand from that what makes people become more open thinkers. Because if we can all become more rigid and extreme thinkers, that also means that we can all also go the other way and become more flexible, more open-minded, more rooted in evidence rather than in these grand narratives that try to persuade us that the world works in very rigid, narrow, and closed ways. And so I hope that the book gives readers really a sense of what it means to think flexibly in their own private lives, and that this task, or kind of this quest to think in a more flexible way that is receptive to evidence, is this arduous task, but one that is also incredibly fulfilling because it's a way for us to think more authentically, more freely, to be closer to our direct experience of the world, rather than to have all these ideological filters close us off from the world.
Thank you, Lior. Okay, everyone, you can get a copy of The Ideological Brain at your favorite bookstore. If you could use some more life and career advice, go to nextbigideaclub.com to check out our hardback subscription club. We'll send the best new nonfiction books as chosen by our curators, Adam Grant, Malcolm Gladwell, Dan Pink, and Susan Cain. That's nextbigideaclub.com. I'm Michael Kovnat. Hope to see you tomorrow.